So good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you very much for staying at this late date at the Southeast Linux Fest. My name is Brian Proffitt. I am the community liaison for the Overt project. I'll be describing that in a little bit more detail later on. Thank you for your patience and with this presentation. It is new, so feel free. I believe in the open source feedback model. So at the end, when you have questions, you can also have critiques and comments and whatnot, and let me know what you thought, and we can make it better. So this is one of those talks that turned into a much larger thing. Like the Linux kernel itself, it started off with a small idea, in that every time that I would do a talk about Overt, which is a virtual data center management program, I would have to immediately compare it to what is known as cloud computing, because they are, while they share many characteristics as platforms for managing virtual machines, these are not necessarily the same kinds of things. So Randy Bias had come up with what is probably a fairly familiar euphemism. Pets, that in a data center, you treat your virtual machines as pets. And in the cloud, you treat them as cattle. And me being the smart aleck that I am, I kept coming up with different ways of describing that, because I thought, wow, if you're an animal rights person, that kind of thing just sucks. So I wanted to say, okay, so let's do the vegan way of doing it, which would be, so the virtual machine management and the data center is more like heirloom tomatoes, and the cloud is like a field of soybeans. So they're still plants, you're still consuming them, but you're doing it in a totally different way and managing it that way. So that's sort of the super secret origin of this talk. And then it's kind of built into something much larger, because as I talk to everybody in this community, both within the open source community and without the open source community, there are a lot of similarities and patterns in what we do in IT that kind of make you want to stand back and say, oh, there's something more to what we're doing here. So I'm presenting this idea. Okay, so once upon a time, because you can't have a metaphor without a story, because basically a metaphor is a story. We had the pretty little unicorn running through the forest. These things are going to kill us all, right? I don't know why. When I looked for this image, whew, it was scary. So maybe not this once upon a time. Maybe let's get back really far once upon a time. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning of humankind. Okay, and how that, how the culture evolved at the time, where you had what scientists believe were a nomadic tribe of people, not really into agriculture, mostly doing a lot of hunting and gathering, and fishing and whatnot, not really staying in one place, because this is well before the dawn of agriculture. Okay, so this is like really far back. There's no fairy tales here as far as this story goes. People had to eat. Okay, that's pretty much a given. We, you, me, we have to eat. Some of us, we eat good things. Some of us, we eat bad things, but that's another story. But we all had to eat. And without really a big amount of structured language, scientists describe this as proto-language at this point, where like animals, there are some basic signals and things getting across between the humans in these tribes. And we're talking about probably even pre-Homo sapiens, so not even really humans at this point, okay? But generally, there was not really a lot of real language in a sophisticated way. Now, some would argue that that's not the case, and I'm not going to get into that right now. But we can all agree people had to eat, okay? And this wasn't a thing yet, okay? Because this is amazing. When I travel now for my job and I go out and talk to people in various places around the world, I could not imagine a world, and I can because I'm old, imagining a world like this without this is difficult. I can't imagine how things are done. You know, my mom still has an actual paper road atlas in the back seat of her car, and I'm like, what? You know, but phones break, she say, so you know, good for her. So this wasn't a thing. Cavemen didn't have anything remotely like this. They didn't even have basically rudimentary mapping skills or geometric skills to sort of, you know, get the point across as to where things were. So this was the thing. So these, you've seen ancient cave art in various caves. I believe these are the ones from the famous caves in France, whose name I unfortunately can't pronounce. Thank you very much. He gets a star. So um, this is what they were for. Okay, this wasn't just like, hey, I'm gonna paint pretty pictures of, you know, deer and antelope and cattle or mammoths or whatever. This was actually survival. Okay, yeah, this was telling a story. They were using what little language they had. They were using what little artistic skills they had, and they were really trying to innovate here and build ways to describe to themselves and more importantly to the next generations. Okay, they had to pass this generational knowledge on, and artwork was even better at language, what language they had, because it was more permanent and it was more static and you could get the ideas across. So storytelling was very much a survival tactic. Now let's we just fast forward. We get on the Wayback Machine. We're coming up. Here we are, the 21st century, where there are no flying cars. I'm not bitter, really, but okay. So here we are. We're in the 21st century, and that's well and good. And storytelling today is pretty much what we would consider an artistic form. You know, I used to love it because when I got started in this industry, I was writing books about Linux, and I would love to do this. I would go to parties, you know, when my wife would let me out of the house and I cleaned up well enough. And I would go to parties and they would say, "Oh, what do you do?" And I would love to say, "Oh, I'm an author," you know. And I didn't go as far as getting me, you know, the tweed jacket with the leather, you know, patches and the pipe and anything like that. But you know, it's kind of cool, you know. Say, yeah, I'm an author. There's a little cachet there, a little artistic flavor to the job. And then, of course, they'd say, "Well, what do you write?" And then I would tell them, and it's like the light just went out of their heads. You know, I write books about Linux, and they're like, so, so there I am standing by the chip dip by myself. You know, well, okay. But there is an artistic cachet to storytelling. We value our storytellers, whether they are using the medium of video or, you know, audio podcasts, which are coming back in a great way, or the written word. Okay, storytelling is art, and we say that all the time. And I think that's something we pretty much agree on. But what I wanted to kind of explore a little bit is that it's not just about art. It's present in a lot of what we would consider maybe more utilitarian ways. And we as a community are very much a part of actual storytelling. So every story worth its salt has the use of metaphors and similes and other literary tools that, you know, get the point across. So you see this picture and you say, you look at it a while, and you probably have intuited this is something along the lines of time is money. Okay? And if not, time is money. It's also sleepy time, but I can't get that in there. So time is money. It's a metaphor. We get that in our culture. Other cultures have different metaphors, obviously. I'm being English-centric right now. But there are different metaphors in different cultures and different language sets that people understand. They understand the meaning of time as money. And there are other, more sophisticated and more specialized metaphors too. If I were to say to you that perhaps the Earth was being visited by a very large artificial object with maybe perhaps 1/3 the mass of the moon, and it was in orbit and it had a very large destructive ray gun device in it, and I go on and on and on about the technical specs about this, okay, you may have gotten the message that this might be something we would worry about. But in our culture, I could say something more simplified like that. Okay. If I say that's no moon, pretty much anybody who's seen a movie in the last 20 years is pretty much going to say, uh-oh, it's time to hide. Time to get off the planet, boys and girls. Um, that's a metaphor. We know what that is. It's a cultural reference that we understand. It's very simplified, but we know what that line means. That means the danger is there. It's disguised. It appears to be something else, but it's clearly a much more imminent threat that we should pay attention to. And it's just one line from a movie, but it permeates some part of our culture. Maybe not everybody, but people usually get this. Software is the same way. It's very hard to describe software visually. So I went back to one of these punch cards and I said, okay, so because for me, I'm not this old, but when I was a kid, before I would actually touch a computer, this was still going on. Okay. And so, you have what is very much abstract representations, hugely abstract representations of data and information that are represented on punch cards. And there are a whole mass of other interfaces that I couldn't even show you here. And what's important to understand here, even from the very beginning, where clearly there's a huge need to get this into English or French or whatever, human language is a better way to describe it. We have to get that into human language. And that requires storytelling. It requires metaphors and similes and things to kind of help people understand why this is important and what it means. And we do this every single day. Now, I'm going to bring up some examples of how this sort of works. Sometimes we describe and use metaphors and similes and basic visual representations based on a kind of job. So we have here one of the early versions of Scrooge's A Christmas, or Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And we see my man Scrooge there doing hard work, giving Bob Cratchit the runaround and, basically just making this life miserable. And, their job, in case you haven't read Dickens in a while, they were moneylenders, basically. And so there was a great deal of accounting. And to do that kind of accounting, you have Scrooge sitting there at the desk with the one lump of coal on the stove because he's a mean, stingy son of a blah, 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 blah. And he's working on one of these, the spreadsheet. This is actually the prototype for the spreadsheet. This is a real world model of the spreadsheet. And if you haven't seen this is actually a fairly small one. But in the original use of these things, some of these ledgers got pretty big. I teach a course at Notre Dame on spreadsheets and for the business students. So because they pretty much need to know how to use this stuff when they're doing their, getting their undergraduate degree. And I tell them, here's what this is why we do this. And they kind of understand it a little bit better. The fact that we have a page, a book full of pages with rows and columns in them. And obviously in the original version, you had to hand write everything. And black ink, red ink, if you were getting fancy to do negatives, and you go through that. And deity help you if you got something wrong. Because unlike going into one cell now and just go boop, boop, and changing it like that, no, you had to basically rewrite the whole page sometimes if that happened. Okay. So this became, I'm sorry it's so small, this early representations of VisiCalc. And you can kind of see, okay, we've got the rows and the cells. We don't really have the pages and whatnot, but we certainly do now. Here's LibreOffice, a relatively recent addition, and this is Calc. Okay, and we see it in Excel and any of the other spreadsheet programs that are out there. Basically, you have your page. Along the bottom, they're a little hard to see, but they're in those colored tabs down there. Those are individual pages, worksheets within a workbook. And I take the time to explain this to my students because they need to it helps them to understand the metaphor that's going on here. The whole spreadsheet concept was basically mimicking a real world object and turning it into something that people could understand. And if you step back and think about it, there's two ways of approaching that. One is, well, of course they did. That's the easiest way. Why wouldn't they do it that way? And indeed, why wouldn't they? But the other thing that kind of really tickles my fancy a little bit is that why didn't they go another way? Is there another way to represent mathematical accounting? It's not calculus or anything. So accounting and arithmetic calculations in a way that conveys the information the same way. Why are we stuck on this metaphor? The answer is probably it's a pretty good metaphor. You know, it's relatively intuitive once you point it out. But how many of you have remember that it is a workbook holding worksheets and things like that? See, we use it, but we don't know it sometimes. This is a problem with our technology. It comes up to fore. So that's the origin of the spreadsheet. Sometimes the interface is dictated by, or dictates the metaphor. So this is an early Xerox PARC representation, one of the earliest GUIs that they existed out there. And I tried to find something that was as cool and nifty looking as I could. And so the idea in the Xerox PARC GUI was to try to convey a lot of visual information using this new thing called the mouse and working with the keyboard and getting this visually across. And so they were adopting a new metaphor, which if you really, really think about it, makes no sense. The only part of this metaphor that makes sense to me is the desktop. Okay, yeah, it's the desktop. I took my desktop here and I put it up here. Okay, that makes sense. But then when you start looking at the individual terminology, then you're like, wait, what? You know, because now it's Windows. It's basically WIMP. You know, the WIMP interface basically controls everything. So you've got windows and menus and radio buttons and things like that. And if you think about it, it's like radio buttons. How many people actually know what a radio button really is? One? Yeah.